That's my timber! The woman's shriek was sharp and loud, cutting through the peaceful morning air by the lake. She pointed a trembling finger at my woodpile, her face twisted with anger. I was just quietly unloading firewood at my family's cabin, a place that had always been my sanctuary. I had no idea this was the beginning of a long and terrible nightmare. She had no idea what that wood really was, and I had no idea how far she would go when she felt cornered. This wasn't just a simple disagreement between neighbors. It was about to turn into the biggest fight of my life. By the time it was all over, one of us would have nothing left. My name is Mark Thompson, and I come from a family of woodworkers. My grandfather taught me everything I know. He also left me the lakeside cabin where this whole mess started. Our family has owned this place for more than 60 years. It sits on 2 beautiful acres of land in Minnesota, right by the water. My grandfather bought this land back in the 1960s, and it's been our family's special retreat ever since. I remember coming here every summer, since I was a little boy, maybe 8 years old. I would spend weeks with my grandfather, learning how to work with wood. The smell of freshly cut logs, the feel of the different wood grains under my fingers, the amazing feeling of creating something beautiful with my own 2 hands. This cabin taught me all of that. It was my school, my playground, and my home away from home. What it never prepared me for, though, was how to deal with a neighbor who seemed to come straight from a horror story. It was a Tuesday morning in the beginning of September. The air was crisp, and the lake was calm. I was backing my old pickup truck down the gravel driveway. The bed of the truck was filled to the brim with what, to anyone else, would look like a simple load of firewood. But I knew better. This was no ordinary wood. I had spent the last 2 months hunting for each and every piece. I traveled across 3 different states, talking to special suppliers, looking for the perfect logs. This wood was for a project I had been dreaming about for 7 long years. These logs were not meant to be burned in the fireplace to keep warm. They were the building blocks of something incredibly special, something that would be a tribute to my grandfather's memory and a gift for my own family's future. I was unloading each piece with great care, like a librarian handling ancient books. I checked every log for any damage that might have happened during the trip. I arranged them in neat, organized stacks. I sorted them by the type of wood and the pattern of the grain. This wood was precious, and I treated it that way. That was the moment she showed up. Her name was Victoria Hartwell. She had moved into the huge, modern mansion next door about 3 months before. Our only interactions until that point had been a few polite waves when we saw each other across our yards. She was the kind of woman who drove a big, shiny white SUV that looked like it had never even seen a speck of mud. She always wore fancy clothes, the kind you'd see at a high-end country club or a business meeting. I'd heard some stories from other people around the lake about her. They said she had caused a lot of trouble in her last neighborhood, fighting with other homeowners. At the time, I just thought it was small-town gossip. I figured people moved to a place like this lake community to find peace and quiet, to get away from the drama of the city. I thought she would be the same. I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. "Excuse me." Her voice was like a chainsaw starting up, suddenly and loudly breaking the morning calm. "Excuse me? What in the world do you think you are doing?" I looked up from a beautiful piece of oak I was holding. I saw Victoria marching across her perfect green lawn, heading straight for my property. Her face was already bright red with anger. She was pointing at my woodpile as if it had done something terrible to her. "You can't just steal my tree and act like nothing happened," she yelled, her voice getting louder. "That's my timber you're unloading there." I was so surprised, I think I blinked a few times, trying to make sure I had heard her correctly. She was claiming that this wood that I had paid for with my own money, that I had driven hundreds of miles to pick up in my own truck, and that I was now stacking on my own land, belonged to her. "Ma'am, I really think there has been a big misunderstanding," I said. I put the oak board down carefully and started walking toward her, keeping my hands in plain sight so she could see I meant no harm. This wood came from a special supplier in Wisconsin. I have all the papers, the receipts, everything to prove it. But Victoria had no interest in seeing my papers or having a reasonable talk. She was already pulling her cell phone out of her purse. I could hear the beeps as she quickly dialed a number. "I'm calling the police right now," she announced. "You sneaked over here sometime last night and cut down my beautiful oak tree. You thought you could just haul it away like a common criminal." The accusation was so crazy that I almost started to laugh. But then I looked into her eyes. The anger I saw there was real. This wasn't some silly joke or a simple mistake. This woman truly believed that I had crept onto her property in the dead of night and stolen a tree. About 20 minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Two sheriff's cars drove up, their lights flashing. Their arrival made other neighbors peek out of their windows and doors, curious about what was happening. The peaceful morning was officially over. One of the officers, Deputy Martinez, was an older man, maybe in his 50s. He had tired eyes that looked like they had seen more than their fair share of silly neighbor fights. His partner was much younger, looking like he had just graduated from the police academy. He seemed excited, probably thinking he was about to solve a straightforward property crime. As soon as the deputies got out of their cars, Victoria started her dramatic performance. She told them her story about the theft of her precious oak tree. She waved her arms around, pointing at my woodpile, and then back at her yard. She demanded that they arrest me on the spot. I just stood there quietly and waited for her to finish her story. When she was done, I calmly showed the deputies my evidence. I had a folder with all the purchase receipts, the delivery invoices from the supplier, and even some photos I had taken on my phone when I was at the supplier's yard, picking out the wood. The young deputy took the documents and looked at each one very carefully. Meanwhile, Deputy Martinez walked over to my woodpile. He looked at the logs with the careful eye of someone who knew a thing or two about wood. You could tell he could see the difference between freshly cut wood from a local tree and the carefully aged and seasoned boards that I had stacked. After a few minutes, he turned to Victoria. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said in a calm, steady voice, "this paperwork all seems to be correct, and to be honest, this wood doesn't look like it came from around here. These are different types of trees altogether." Victoria's face went from red to a dark, angry shade of purple. "That's impossible!" she shrieked. "I know what I saw! He must have faked those papers!" The accusation was so ridiculous that it just hung in the air for a moment. Deputy Martinez looked at me and gave a small shrug, as if to say, "Sorry you have to deal with this." He turned back to me and said, "Sir, everything you're doing here seems to be perfectly legal. I would suggest you two try to work this out like good neighbors." As the deputies got back into their cars and drove away, Victoria just stood there, shaking with rage. She was staring at my woodpile, as if it had personally betrayed her. As I watched her, I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, something cold and calculating. It was a look that told me this fight was far from over. After the police left, I stood among my stacks of precious lumber and tried to understand what had just happened. This was not a normal misunderstanding. Victoria had looked me right in the eye, accused me of being a thief, and demanded that the police arrest me. Even when she was shown clear, undeniable proof that she was wrong, she refused to believe it. Her reaction was so extreme, so irrational, that it made me feel a deep sense of unease. It felt like this wasn't the first time she had behaved this way. I picked up one of the beautiful oak boards again. I ran my hand along its smooth, perfect surface, feeling the detailed lines of the grain that had taken so many decades to form. I just wanted to prepare my wood. I whispered to myself, shaking my head. I never thought I would be starting a war. But I had a feeling that Vicky really didn't know who she was messing with. She had picked a fight with the wrong person. The harassment began the very next day. I was sitting on the front porch of my cabin, enjoying my morning cup of coffee and the quiet beauty of the lake. Suddenly, a loud noise broke the peace. A big truck from a lawn service company pulled up to Victoria's house. Soon after, 3 workers got out, carrying heavy-duty equipment. Victoria came out onto her deck and told them they were there to do some boundary maintenance. The workers started up their chainsaws and brush cutters and began clearing away plants and small trees along the line between our properties. At first, I thought she was just cleaning up her side of the yard, but then I watched, completely stunned, as they started moving onto my land. There was a huge granite boulder that had been sitting at the corner of our properties for as long as anyone could remember. It was a natural marker that had been noted on official property surveys for decades. I watched in disbelief as the workers used levers and sheer force to roll the massive rock a full 6 feet over right onto my property. After they moved the boulder, they started putting in posts, getting ready to build a new fence that would cut deep into my land. I knew I couldn't just sit there and watch. I had to do something. "Hold on there," I called out, walking over to them. I had a copy of my official property survey in my hand. The crew's foreman, a man who looked like he was just trying to get through his day, looked nervous when I showed him the paper. The survey clearly showed the official boundary line and where the old granite boulder was supposed to be. He could see that his crew was working on the wrong side of the line. Ma'am told us to clear the land up to the new stakes, he said, sounding apologetic. He pointed to some bright orange stakes that Victoria must have hammered into the ground during the night. But you're right. These stakes don't match your survey at all. I spent the next 20 minutes patiently explaining the situation to the workers. They were just doing the job they were paid to do, and I didn't blame them. All the while, Victoria watched the whole scene from her deck. She had a smug, satisfied smirk on her face. Finally, I convinced the foreman that they were on my property illegally. He told his crew to stop working and pack up their equipment. As they left, Victoria turned around and went back into her house without saying a single word. That evening, I made a phone call to a man named Tom Rivera. Tom was a professional land surveyor who I had hired a couple of years ago when I did some renovations on the cabin. I knew he was the right person to call. Tom was a serious professional who did not take property boundary issues lightly, especially when someone was trying to steal land. "Mark, I remember your property well from the renovation project," he said over the phone. "That big granite boulder has been in that exact same spot since the first survey was done in 1978. If someone moved it, we have all the legal documents to prove exactly where it belongs." We agreed that he would come out the next morning to do a full, official boundary check. I went to bed that night feeling a little better, thinking that this whole mess would be cleared up quickly once we had the professional documentation. I was wrong again. The next morning, my surveyor, Tom Rivera, arrived. Victoria immediately stormed out of her mansion, screaming at him for trespassing, but Tom calmly ignored her threats and continued his work. His survey soon proved what I had suspected. Victoria had deliberately moved several historic boundary markers, including a massive boulder and an old fence post, in a calculated attempt to steal nearly half an acre of my land. Tom confirmed it wasn't a mistake, but a systematic theft. This discovery pushed me to investigate Victoria herself. I spent the day on the phone with other neighbors and digging through public records. A disturbing pattern quickly emerged. She had a long history of harassing people, filing frivolous complaints, and using legal threats to intimidate her neighbors. I learned she had even driven the previous owners of her house away with her constant attacks. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was a serial predator who used the system to terrorize people, and I was her new target. That night, I decided to fight back with her own methodical approach. I installed a full security camera system around my cabin and began building a powerful case against her, complete with Tom's survey, photos, and statements from her other victims. She had picked a fight with someone who understood patience and precision. I would measure everything twice, and when I finally acted, it would be with devastating force. I knew I needed a good lawyer. I found Anna Mitchell. She had a reputation for being the toughest property rights lawyer in the whole Tri-County area. Her office walls were like a gallery of her victories, covered with framed newspaper articles about cases she had won against aggressive HOAs and harassing neighbors. When I sat down in her conference room and laid out all the evidence I had collected, her expression changed. She went from looking professionally interested to genuinely concerned. I showed her Tom Rivera's detailed survey, the photographs of the moved boundary markers, and the written statements from other lake residents who had been targeted by Victoria. "Mark, what you're describing here is not just some simple neighbor drama," Anna said, spreading the boundary maps out on her big conference table. "This is a systematic attempt to steal your property, combined with a campaign of psychological warfare. We need to act quickly before she decides to escalate things even further." The letter Anna wrote was a work of art. It was a cease and desist letter, but it was much more than that. It was a masterpiece of legal language, precise and powerful. The letter listed every single instance of Victoria's boundary encroachment. It quoted the specific property laws that she had broken. It demanded that she immediately move all the boundary markers back to their original, legally documented positions. We included a full copy of Tom Rivera's survey as solid proof. We also included my photographs of the land she had tried to steal, and the sworn testimonials from 3 other lake residents who could confirm Victoria's pattern of harassment. "This should definitely get her attention," Anna said with a confident smile as she put the letter into a certified mail envelope. "If she has any sense, she'll back down now and restore your boundaries. And if she's not smart, well, we'll be ready for the next step." Victoria's response came much faster than we had expected, but it didn't come through a lawyer or any official channel. Instead of addressing the very serious legal claims in our cease and desist letter, she decided to launch an all-out war against me on social media. It was incredible how fast she moved. Within 24 hours of receiving Anna's letter, posts started popping up on all the local community Facebook groups and online message boards. The posts were all from Victoria, and they all painted me as a dangerous and aggressive monster. She claimed that I was a threatening neighbor who had intimidated her. She posted photos of herself that were carefully staged to make her look sad and distressed. She wrote long, dramatic captions about how she was being terrorized by a man who thought he could just steal her property. The posts were cleverly written. They were designed to make people feel sorry for her, the poor, innocent victim, while making me look like some kind of unstable and dangerous person. Her smear campaign worked, at least at first. It worked better than I ever would have thought possible. A woman named Margaret Pierce, who was the president of our informal lake homeowners association, called for an emergency community meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to address the safety concerns that Victoria had raised. On that Thursday evening, as my neighbors started to file into the community center, I could feel the division that Victoria had created. Some people wouldn't even look at me. They avoided my eyes completely. Others gave me small, supportive nods, letting me know they were on my side. Victoria made a grand entrance. She was dressed as if she were going to a funeral, all in black. She even had a pair of dark sunglasses on, and was clutching a handful of tissues, ready to play her part as the grieving victim. "We are here tonight because one of the members of our community feels threatened and unsafe," Margaret began, and I knew right away that Victoria had gotten to her first and filled her head with her side of the story. "Victoria has brought some very serious concerns to my attention about boundary violations and intimidation tactics. We need to address this as a community before someone gets hurt." Victoria's performance was worthy of an Oscar. She spoke in a shaky, trembling voice. "She told everyone that she was afraid to even leave her own house. She repeated her lie that I had stolen her property, and then threatened her when she confronted me about it. When she pointed to my woodpile as her evidence of the theft, I saw several of my neighbors nodding their heads in sympathy. They were buying her act. But then, something happened that she didn't expect. My lawyer, Anna, had given me some very good advice. She told me to stay calm, let Victoria talk, and let her dig her own hole. And that is exactly what happened. When Margaret Pierce asked for my side of the story, I didn't get angry or defensive. I simply stood up and handed out copies of Tom Rivera's official survey and the cease and desist letter to everyone in the room. "These documents speak for themselves," I said in a quiet, calm voice. "The wood that Victoria claims I stole from her was purchased legally from a supplier in Wisconsin. The boundaries that she claims I violated have been established and documented for more than 40 years. And the intimidation she's talking about was actually me politely asking her workers to stop illegally clearing trees on my property." The entire mood in the room began to shift as people started reading the documents I had handed out. I watched Margaret's face change from concerned to confused as she studied the detailed boundary maps from the survey. "Victoria," she said slowly, looking up from the paper, "according to this official survey, it looks like you are the one who moved established boundary markers onto Mark's property. Is that correct?" That was when Victoria's carefully constructed act of being a helpless victim started to fall apart. "That survey is wrong," she snapped. Her voice was no longer shaky and weak, it was sharp and angry. "I know where my property ends. I don't need some so-called expert to tell me otherwise." At that moment, I decided it was time to reveal something else, something I had been keeping to myself. "Since Victoria seems to be so very interested in my woodpile," I said, standing up to address the whole room, "maybe I should take a moment to explain what that lumber is actually for." The room fell completely silent. I could see Victoria leaning forward in her chair, a look of curiosity on her face despite her anger. "This isn't just firewood," I explained. "It's the raw material for a very special project. A project that I have been planning for 7 years. Every single piece of that wood has been carefully selected. It would be handcrafted into furniture for my family." Margaret looked confused, and some of my neighbors glanced at each other, raising their eyebrows. "Furniture?" one of them asked. "What kind of furniture needs that much wood?" I allowed myself a small smile. I knew I had everyone's complete attention now. "The kind of furniture that takes a master craftsman several years to build," I said. "And the kind that is worth a lot more money than most people would ever guess." I saw Victoria's face go pale. I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she tried to do the math. "But," I continued, looking directly at her, "if Victoria wants to keep claiming that she owns lumber that she has never seen before, lumber that was purchased with money she never spent, then maybe she should explain to all of us how she acquired property that was supposedly cut from a tree that is, by the way, still standing perfectly healthy in her yard." The simple, undeniable logic of what I said hit the room like a cold wave of reality. It was impossible for her story to be true. A few of the neighbors actually started to laugh out loud. Margaret stood up. She looked embarrassed and a little bit angry. "Victoria, I think you and I need to have a private conversation after this meeting is over," she said in a firm voice. Then she turned to me. "Mark, I want to apologize for all the confusion tonight. It seems there may have been some very serious misunderstandings about this situation. As people started to leave the community center, several of my neighbors came up to me. They apologized for doubting me and offered their support. Victoria was left sitting all by herself at the front of the room. She was staring at the copy of my woodpile documentation, as if it contained some terrible secret that she had only just discovered. Later that night, I got a text message from Margaret. It said, "I think I may have completely misjudged the situation with Victoria. Some of the other neighbors have been sharing stories with me that are very concerning. We should talk soon." The tide was finally turning in my favor, but I had a strong feeling that Victoria wouldn't give up so easily. A person with her kind of history, her pattern of behavior, doesn't just back down because they've been publicly exposed. If anything, being backed into a corner would only make her more desperate and more dangerous. Our case was finally scheduled to be heard in court 3 weeks later. The judge assigned to our case was Judge Robert Harrison. He had a reputation for being a no-nonsense judge who had been dealing with property disputes for over 20 years. Local lawyers knew that you didn't mess around in his courtroom. As I walked into the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of confidence. I believed that once our case was presented in a professional legal setting, Victoria's lies and fabricated claims would be exposed for what they were: a calculated campaign of harassment based on things she had completely made up. My lawyer, Anna, had prepared our case perfectly. She had every piece of evidence neatly organized. We had Tom Rivera, the land surveyor, ready to testify. We had all the photographic evidence of the boundary encroachment. We even had written statements from multiple lake residents who were willing to testify about Victoria's long pattern of aggressive and harassing behavior. Victoria arrived at the courthouse with her own lawyer. He was a nervous-looking man named David Lee, who kept looking at his client as if he wasn't quite sure what he had gotten himself into. Victoria was dressed in a conservative suit for her court appearance, but her behavior was anything but calm and reserved. Even before the judge entered the courtroom, she was pointing her finger at me aggressively and whispering urgently to her lawyer. When Judge Harrison finally called the court to order, Victoria immediately tried to interrupt him. She started shouting about how the proceedings were biased against her and demanded that the judge issue an emergency restraining order against me. "Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Harrison said in a very firm voice, "you will have your chance to present your case. Until then, I suggest you please remain quiet." Anna began our presentation by calling Tom Rivera to the stand. Tom was professional, calm, and thorough. He explained to the court exactly how the established property markers had been deliberately moved. He even provided the precise GPS coordinates that proved, without a doubt, the extent of Victoria's encroachment onto my property. When Victoria's lawyer, Mr. Lee, tried to question Tom's credentials and expertise, Judge Harrison shut him down immediately. "Mr. Rivera is a licensed surveyor with 15 years of experience in this field," the judge said sternly. "His testimony will stand." Then it was Victoria's turn to present her case, and that's when things went from serious to just plain bizarre. Instead of presenting any kind of professional documentation, expert testimony, or real evidence, Victoria produced a piece of cardboard. It looked like it had been torn from the back of a large pizza box. On it, she had drawn a crude map with a marker. "This shows the real property boundaries," she announced to the court, holding up her hand, drawn sketch as if it were a legally binding document. "That surveyor was obviously paid off by the defendant to produce false maps." Judge Harrison just stared at the pizza box map for a long, silent moment. Then he asked, "Mrs. Hartwell, are you telling me that you just presented a hand-drawn sketch on a piece of cardboard as evidence in my courtroom?" Victoria's response was to get even more agitated. She started demanding that the judge accept her documentation and order my immediate arrest for theft. "Your Honor, this is clearly a conspiracy," she yelled. "It's a conspiracy between the defendant and his hired surveyor to steal my land. That pile of wood you see over there came from my tree, and I demand justice." Judge Harrison's patience was clearly wearing thin, but he allowed her to keep talking. And that's when Victoria made the biggest mistake of the case, a mistake that would come back to haunt her. "I don't care if he has some fake receipts," she screamed, pointing her finger directly at me. "That's just a pile of firewood anyway. Who cares about a bunch of old logs? The entire courtroom fell silent. Anna looked over at me and raised her eyebrows. We both knew this was the moment we had been waiting for. With Judge Harrison's permission, I stood up slowly and walked over to the evidence table. Several pieces of my precious lumber were displayed there for the court to see. Your Honor, I said calmly, Mrs. Hartwell just made a very interesting statement about the value of this wood. I picked up one of the beautiful oak boards. I turned it slowly in my hands so that the intricate grain would catch the light from the courtroom's fluorescent bulbs. This pile of firewood, as she calls it, I continued, is actually worth more than the house she is living in. You could hear people gasping all around the courtroom. Victoria's face went from angry red to ghost white in a matter of seconds. That's impossible, she shouted. You're lying! It's just wood! But Anna was already walking toward the judge's bench. She was carrying a thick folder full of documents that we had not yet presented to the court. Your Honor, Anna said, my client has been collecting these special materials for a very specific project for the past 7 years. Each and every piece has been professionally appraised and documented. She handed the folder to Judge Harrison. I watched as his eyebrows shot up while he flipped through the pages of appraisals. Mrs. Hartwell, Judge Harrison said, looking up from the documents and staring directly at Victoria. Are you aware that the firewood you are claiming ownership of has been professionally appraised at a value of over $300,000? The number 300, zero, hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Victoria's lawyer was so stunned that he actually dropped his pen. Several people in the gallery gasped out loud. Margaret Pierce, who had come to the courthouse to watch the proceedings, covered her mouth with her hand in disbelief. Victoria herself looked as if she had been physically slapped across the face. 300? Zero? Victoria whispered, her eyes now wide with shock. She was staring at the lumber on the evidence table with a completely new expression. For wood? In that single moment, her entire attitude shifted. The angry, self-righteous woman disappeared. In her place was someone much more calculating and much more dangerous. I could practically see the wheels turning in her mind as she reevaluated everything she thought she knew about me, my property, and my project. This was no longer just a fight about a property line. Now, it was about a very serious amount of money. Judge Harrison continued to carefully review the appraisal documents. All the while, Victoria's lawyer was frantically whispering in her ear, probably trying to figure out what to do next. Mr. Thompson, the judge said finally, this documentation appears to be completely legitimate. These are indeed very valuable materials, not simple firewood. He then turned his gaze back to Victoria. His expression made it clear that his patience had run out completely. Mrs. Hartwell, you have presented zero credible evidence to support your claim of ownership. Your claims about the boundary line have been thoroughly debunked by a licensed surveyor, and you have just admitted in open court that you believe this valuable property was worthless firewood. Do you have any legitimate legal basis for any of your claims? Victoria's response was to spiral even further into delusion. She accused me of hiding my assets and of trying to defraud the court with fake appraisals. She demanded that the judge order a real investigation into how I could have possibly acquired such valuable materials. She even suggested that no honest person could ever afford to make such an investment. Her lawyer looked more and more uncomfortable as his client dug herself into a deeper and deeper hole with her wild conspiracy theories and personal attacks. Judge Harrison finally had enough. He called for a recess, but not before he gave Victoria a stern warning. He told her that if she continued to disrupt the court, she would be held in contempt. During the break, I saw Victoria pacing back and forth in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was on her phone, talking frantically, and waving her hands around. The look in her eyes had changed. It was no longer just anger. It was something much more desperate and much more dangerous. She had started this fight thinking she was arguing over a simple pile of logs. Now, she knew she was dealing with a significant fortune. And when a person like Victoria finds out about that kind of value, especially in something she can't control, history has shown that she won't just walk away quietly. That evening, I saw her car parked on the road outside my cabin. She sat there for over an hour, just staring at my lumber pile with those same cold, calculating eyes. I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I felt like she was planning something that would make all of her previous harassment seem like child's play. The attack came at 2:17 a.m., and my security cameras captured everything. An alert on my phone woke me to the sight of Victoria methodically destroying my valuable woodpile with an axe. After ruining the lumber, she smashed my cabin window and broke the priceless heirloom clock my great-grandfather had made. The sound shattered my self-control, and I ran outside, blinded by a rage so intense I barely remember grabbing the axe myself. Just as I was about to make a life-ruining mistake, my lawyer, Anna, arrived and her voice stopped me cold. She pointed out that this was exactly what Victoria wanted to provoke me into becoming the criminal. I dropped the axe as the police, called by neighbors, arrived. The crystal-clear video footage was undeniable, and they arrested Victoria on the spot for felony destruction of property. At her arraignment 3 days later, Victoria stunned the packed courtroom by pleading, "Not guilty," and continuing to accuse me of theft. Her lawyer claimed I faked the evidence, which gave my lawyer Anna the perfect opening. I explained to the judge that the wood was for a project to recreate my great-grandfather's priceless furniture, a collection now worth a fortune. Anna then presented the official appraisals, revealing the total value of the destroyed project exceeded $2.3 million. A gasp filled the room as Victoria's face went white. For the final blow, Anna revealed the secret I'd kept. A small, signature M stamp, a family tradition, was carved into every single piece of my lumber. The irony was devastating. She had destroyed timber that literally had my name on it. The full weight of her actions finally hit her, and Victoria collapsed, fainting in her chair as justice was finally served. Victoria's sentencing hearing convened 6 weeks later, and the atmosphere in the packed courtroom was profoundly different. The sensationalism was gone, replaced by a somber gravity. Having spent those weeks in a county jail cell, unable to afford the $500,000 bail, Victoria was a shadow of her former self. She looked smaller, her usual defiance replaced by a hollowed-out resignation as she accepted a plea deal, taking full responsibility for the destruction of my historical project. Judge Harrison, who had studied every detail of the case, including psychological reports that detailed her disturbing patterns of behavior, addressed her directly. He spoke of how, in his 20 years on the bench, he had never seen a case that so perfectly represented not just a financial crime, but the deliberate eradication of a family's legacy, a project that was 7 years in the making and could never truly be replaced. His words hung in the air before he delivered her sentence. 18 months in state prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and a permanent order forbidding her from ever contacting me or my property again. The final blow was the financial restitution of $2.3 million, an insurmountable sum that her insurance refused to cover due to the intentional, criminal nature of her act, forcing the complete liquidation of every asset she owned, starting with her prized lakefront mansion. The consequences rippled out into the community, where Margaret Pierce led an emergency homeowners association meeting. United in their regret for ever believing Victoria, the residents unanimously voted to implement stringent new rules and background checks to ensure their peaceful community would never again be infiltrated by such a predator. The wisdom of their decision was affirmed just days later when a plain, unmarked envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside, I found the horrifying truth of Victoria's past. Police reports, court documents, and old newspaper clippings from several states that laid out a 15-year reign of terror. She was a serial harasser who had systematically destroyed lives, forcing families to relocate just to escape her, and in one heartbreaking case, her relentless campaign of fake complaints had driven an 80-year-old widower to suffer a near-fatal heart attack. As I shared these sickening discoveries, the community's support for me became a powerful wave of healing. Neighbors who had once been swayed by her lies now showed up with tool belts to help repair my cabin, and a fund organized by Jim, the retired postmaster, raised a significant sum to help me begin sourcing new wood, a gesture he said was about making sure Victoria's evil doesn't win. Her downfall was absolute and swift. Her infamous mansion, now stained by the story of the timber destruction, eventually sold for a fraction of its worth. The final nail in the coffin of her old life was when her husband, unable to bear the public humiliation and complete financial ruin she had brought upon him, filed for divorce, leaving her utterly and completely alone to face the wreckage she had created. As the autumn leaves fell and winter began to settle over the lake, I found my peace again. I was back in my workshop, the place where I felt most at home. I was carefully crafting the first pieces of my great-grandfather's recreated furniture collection. The new timber I had acquired wasn't exactly the same as the wood Victoria had destroyed, but it was close enough. It would still allow me to honor the original designs and the spirit of my great-grandfather's work. In a way, the project now had an even deeper meaning. It had become a symbol of resilience, of overcoming adversity, and of the incredible power of community support. Margaret Pierce commissioned me to build a special memorial bench for the Lake Community Center. She asked me to incorporate some of the salvaged, damaged pieces of wood from Victoria's attack into the design. It would serve as a permanent reminder to everyone that destructive behavior and hatred ultimately fail when a community stands together in solidarity. The final chapter of Victoria's story appeared in a small newspaper article about 6 months later. It reported that she had been released from prison after serving her full sentence. She had moved to a small, remote town in Nevada. She was reportedly living in a trailer park and working at a local convenience store to try and pay off her massive restitution debt. The woman who had once owned $1 million lakefront mansion and looked down on everyone was now earning minimum wage. Her lifetime of destructive behavior had finally caught up with her in the most complete and total way possible. Now, on quiet evenings, I often sit on my cabin porch. I watch the sunset paint the surface of the lake with brilliant colors. I am surrounded by the slowly growing collection of beautiful furniture pieces that will one day complete my great-grandfather's legacy. The Homeowners Association had unanimously approved a new sign for my property. It stands at the edge of my driveway as a permanent reminder of what we all went through. It's a reminder that property rights matter, that strong communities can overcome the actions of destructive individuals, and that sometimes justice may take a long time, but it always, eventually, arrives. My phone rang just last week. It was a call from my lawyer, Anna Mitchell. "Mark," she said, "I've got another timber dispute case on my hands. This one involves a family out in Colorado. Their neighbor is trying to claim ownership of their antique barnwood collection. I was wondering if you might be interested in consulting on the case." I looked over at my sign, and then out at the peaceful lake. I smiled. "Timber disputes," I said into the phone. "Seems there's always another one, isn't there?" I was ready to help.